This is it, part 3 of session 20, and we're going to end up talking about the stoneheads in Eastern Ireland and the Nazca lines in southern Peru. Let's go. All right, let's bring some context into this last part of session 20. Remember, for the past two sessions, session 19 and this session 20, the line of questioning started going on the 75,000 year cycle, that is third density, that is chopped into three major cycles, that is 25,000 years each. So Don was asking everything about the first major cycle, the first 25,000 years, and now we're nearing the end of this. The last question we covered in the last video was Don asking if the Orion group actually interfered or made contact with humanity back then. And Ra said yes, that this was true, but we didn't get into that. So now we're going to continue talking about that. And Don is going to ask what was this type of contact. And this is going to lead us obviously to the monuments, the moai, as they call them too, the Eastern Island stonehead. So let's get into that. This is going to be a pretty light video in terms of the things we're going to talk about. So the first question that I have continuing session 20, it's actually question number 30. And Don says, what technique did the Orion group use to give this information? Ra says, the technique used was of two kinds. One, the thought transfer, or what you may call telepathy. Two, the arrangement of certain stones in order to suggest strong influences of power, this being those of statues and of rock formations in your Pacific areas, as you now call them, and to an extent in your Central American regions, as you now understand them. Don asks, are you speaking in part of the stoneheads of Eastern Ireland? Ra says, this is correct. Don says, how would such stoneheads influence a people to take the path of service to self? Here we go. Ra says, picture, if you will, the entities living in such a way that their mind-body-spirit complexes are at what seems to be the mercy of forces which they cannot control. Given a charged entity, such as a statue or a rock formation charged with nothing but power, it is possible for the free will of those viewing this particular structure or formation to ascribe to this power over those things which cannot be controlled. This then has the potential for the further distortion to power over other selves. So the Orion group has been using, obviously, telepathy, which any other entity can use to influence us, and that's just part of the balancing of positive and negative influences for service to self and service to others paths. But in the question that Don asked, like, how does these stoneheads can actually influence service to self path? And it actually is a really good question. And Ra explains that these stoneheads, or any monument that can be charged with power, just the imposing power that it has, especially on in the earlier humans in the first cycle, which we're going to get a little bit into in the next question. It's a very imposing figure that can only be ascribed this power to something bigger than them, and that they cannot understand. This to me sounds like when they used it sounds a lot like the typical monument that cannot be explained, and so it is attributed to a god, and that god has certain rules that the person distorted towards service to self, which of course is going to create some sort of religion, cult, or belief system. They will start mentioning or saying that these are the ways of this god and so on. That's to me how it sounds for the primitive mind of the humans, and how this would influence that way, which I'm sure it happened in so many societies as it is. And this is just the natural course of action of the balancing energies of the universe. And I think it's a good time to make that emphasis, because we as humans, especially in this world right now, we kind of get lost in the idea that there is negative, evil people, and then there is positive, beautiful, benign, beings. And the reality is that those two things have been working together over time. The fact that we have an anomaly going on Earth, it's outside the scope of this video, but just to put that into context, especially talking about this type of influence from the Orion Group, it's a very permissible thing to do to create that possibility. But as we know from the last video, if you haven't watched it, go watch it. One of the last questions was I forgot what the question was, but they say that the contact on the Orion Group, they said that it falls on deaf ears, basically. So this did not make any sense to people, and they just didn't care. They simply watched them and said, "Meh, all right, stoneheads. They look cool. That's it." All right, let's go to the next questions. So Don says, "How were these stoneheads constructed?" We kind of know already this answer. These were constructed by thought after a scanning of the deep mind, the trunk of mind tree, looking at the images most likely to cause the experience of awe in the viewer. So really quick, this is what I was going to mention. I thought it was like further ahead, but this is it. They were constructed by thought, just like the pyramids, it seems. And this was after scanning the deep mind, the trunk of mind tree, which kind of gave them an image of what, say, the primitive people in 70,000 years ago, or whenever this was built. I think it was 50-something thousand years ago, in the first major cycle. They were susceptible to this type of image to create the illusion of power, or the idea of power. And the Orion Group scanned what was the appropriate image to provide them, so they can see them like that. A good example would be right now, if we find something like this, we would be probably, a lot less impressed than the people back then, and we would just say like, well, it's an amateur, sculpture. So it really, I guess, it changes the way as humans evolve, and the different souls and incarnations, they start bringing, of course, a lot more knowledge, and they have to devise more trickier ways to further push us towards the service to self path, which now we can see that have been very, very creative. So, all right, that's all I got there. But I thought it was cool to show that the Orion Group actually scanned the people's mind back then to create the best image possible to influence them in the negative path or service to self path. All right, next question, 34. And Don says, well then, did Orion entities do this themselves? Did they land in physical, or did they do it from mental planes? Or did they use one of the incarnate entities to construct these by thought? Ross says, nearly all of these structures and formations were constructed at a distance by thought. Very few were created in later times in imitation of original construct by entities upon your Earth plane density. So yeah, they were constructed pretty simple by a distance, and there was no need to incarnate here or come here with any sort of it seems very primitive to do for advanced or interdimensional beings to do it. There's nothing too important and intricate, I would say, about creating this by thought. I would say that the pyramids, of course, might have been needed, like Ra obviously incarnated here, but these stones, they seem pretty basic. I would suppose that's just like they were delegated to the lowest people or entities in 4 density, which is where the Orion Group mostly comes from. So, and there were others created by us humans in imitation of it. So I suppose the influence was just to say, wow, very creative, I want to make my own. And it actually influenced artists to create their own stones at a later time. So I thought that was cool. All right, let's go on with the next question that we have. And Don says, what density Orion entity did the creation of these heads? I should say this question again. What density Orion entity did the creation of these heads? All right, sounds weird. Ra says, the fourth density, the density of love or understanding, was the density of the particular entity which offered this possibility to those of your first major cycle. Don says, you use the same nomenclature for 4 density negative as for 4 density positive. Both are called a dimension of love or understanding. Is this correct? Ra says, this is correct. Love and understanding, whether it be of self or of self towards other self, is one. So, Don is asking where did these entities come from in the Orion group that did this, like I said, 4 density, and then they say 4 density, love and understanding, the density of love and understanding, and then Don says, you say the same thing. I suppose at this point it was kind of, strange that we were talking about love of the negative path, but of course, Ra explains that it's the same love. It's either you open the heart to others or you close the heart for yourself, and that's totally acceptable in our evolution as souls and spirits and so on. So just a pretty cool clarification there too. All right, Don says now, what was the approximate date in years past of the construction of these heads? And Ra says this approximately was 60,000 of your years in the past time space of your continuum. So exactly, 60,000. What structures were built in South America, Don says. Ra says, in this location were fashioned some characteristic statues, some formations of what you call rock, and some formations involving rock and earth. Don, very perceptive, says, were the lines at Nazca included in this? Ra says, this is correct. Don further inquires, since this can only be seen from an altitude, of what benefit was this? Ra says, the formations were of benefit because charged with energy of power. Okay, so let me make a pause here. So the Nazca lines in Peru can only be seen from an aerial point of view, as you can see in the beautiful images that I have shared here in the video. And this obviously brings Don to ask, how can this be of influence of power if they can only be seen at an altitude? And Ra is saying, very naive, of course, of the idea of the question. We're going to get into that because Don keeps being confused with this. And they said the formations were of benefit because of charge of energy of power. Now this, I guess there's something also in at the time that there was a power, and that's why I wanted to make an emphasis here, that could be felt by the primitive people in 60,000 years ago or so, and they would see this as something, not only see it but feel it as they went there, and they could maybe be charged with this power, this energy of power, and polarize them or influence them towards the service to self path. But the question that Don really wanted to ask was this one, when he says, I'm a little confused. These lines at Nazca are hardly understandable for an entity walking on the surface. He cannot see anything but a disruption of the surface. However, if you go up to a high altitude, you can see the patterns. How was it of benefit to the entities walking on the surface? And now Ra explains. At the remove of the amount of time-space which is now your present, it is difficult to perceive that at the time-space 60,000 years ago, the Earth was formed in such a way as to be visibly arranged in powerful structural designs from the vantage point of distant hills. So, that's it. That's the mystery. There were hills around that could create a vantage point, very beautiful for the entities to see from afar these lines created. And of course, this would have the same power. It's almost like the crop circles that we see today. Very similar, actually. But the crop circles are, they're pretty not disposable. They're easily broken down and they don't last too long, whereas these ones have been going on for 60,000 years or so. So that's the reason, that's the mystery why they were at our time now. It's not easy to see them from from surface level. But I guess, you know, the changes on Earth, which have been 60,000 years, they changed the topography of the Earth, and now we just can't see them that way. We just have to fly. So, all right, next question. One of the last ones too. Don says, in other words, at that time, there were hills overlooking these lines. And Ra says, the entire smoothness, as you see this area now, was built up in many places in hills. The time-space continuum has proceeded with wind and weather, as you would say, to erode to a great extent both the somewhat formidable structures of Earth design at that time and the nature of the surrounding countryside. The last question, Don says, is, I think I understand then. Then these lines are just the faint traces of what used to be there. Ra says, this is correct. So, again, this last part was just to finish up session 20. Everything is pretty self-explanatory. I just expanded on a couple of things that I thought it was noteworthy, and those were how they scanned the mind of the primitive entities back 60,000 years ago. I can see now it was 60,000, not 50 something, and they created the structures to create an influence. One of the few things I can conclude of this is the complexity of the mind right now. And this is something that is practical for us right now to see how our minds, and this is something we can definitely extrapolate from this, is that the complexity of our minds have changed over time, over these thousands of years, not only by the evolution or I would say genetic modification that they have done over time, but also the lifespan reduction, which we talked about, and we'll talk further in the next sessions. But that reduction in lifespan also created the possibility of us having a, shall we say, programming of the mind. So we can make use of catalysts a lot more efficiently. So the reason why I'm saying this is because we would think, or we would be inclined to compare ourselves to the original entities that started this first cycle, or this 1/3 density master cycle, and as comparing to them, we know that we have advanced a lot in our ways to perceive reality, in contrast with what they used to. That's the purpose of third density, to improve that perception of reality, so we can create use for that abstract thought that we're now newly using in first density, so we can start exploring those unusable thoughts for sharing, companionship, love, dependency, and so on, that creates that opening of the heart, which is really what's the purpose of third density, to go into fourth density. So again, just to recap, my conclusion here is to say that the complexity of our minds are already at a point where even Ross said in previous sessions, and we're talking about 11,000 years ago or so, the body, the mind, body, spirit complex right now is appropriate to do the same work as the pyramids did in the past. So that's how much we have evolved at a complex level of the human body and the mind, and it's a good thing to know, because we can see the potential that we have for this exploring of the soul. I don't want to say ascension process, could be too, but just the exploring path of understanding the self and so on. So, all right, I hope that conclusion helps out even a little bit. We're exploring some history here that is maybe not that relevant to us right now, but with that little conclusion, that's what I kind of gather of this. Hope it makes sense again. And that's it. Next session will be 21, and we're going to divide it possibly into 2 or 3 videos again, and we're going to explore some new things there, but we're still going to be within the context of the first couple of cycles as we keep exploring this. And we're coming actually to the end of the first book in the Law of One series. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next week on session 21, first video, part 1.